I died in the year I loved him most. He personally sent me to prison, and let the people inside beat me to death. When I opened my eyes again, I had returned to my 18th year, the very year I first met him. In the prison, it was always damp. Huddled in the corner, I rubbed the necklace around my neck, an ordinary small iron pendant containing a photo inside. A wedding photo of Jude and me. My wounds ached faintly. I curled up tighter, trying not to be noticed. But it was no use. "Sophia, please use those pretty piano-playing hands of yours to comb my hair," the woman in prison clothes said with a smile, looking at me. Trembling, I took the comb and looked at my hands. They weren't beautiful anymore. My hands were scarred with burns from cigarette butts. The once delicate fingers had grown rough from endless labor. When I finished combing her hair, she suddenly grabbed my necklace. "What's the secret in this necklace? You've been looking at it every day." I frantically tried to snatch the necklace back from her. "There's nothing, really nothing." The woman opened the metal locket's latch and saw the tiny photo inside. Suddenly, she laughed. "Hey, you're really pathetic. Want to know why I've been targeting you in prison? It was arranged by this man. He promised me a fortune after my release to make your life hell in here." I froze momentarily, instinctively refuting despite my fear of this woman who had once dragged me by the hair. "Impossible. He loves me." The woman bent down and hooked a finger under my chin. "Don't you have a sister who also plays the piano?" My body went rigid. "He said this was the price for what you did to your sister's hand." I ended my life on the very night after learning the truth. When I opened my eyes again, I found myself had reborn. I lay on a bed, my mother brewing medicine for me, its scent deeply familiar. "Sophia, how many times must I say it? You're not a child anymore." I blinked, tears sliding down my face. "Mom?" My mother turned around, about to scold me further, but stopped when she saw my tear-streaked face. "Don't be so willful in the future, taking cold baths just to skip school." This was my most mischievous phase. At 18, my belated teenage rebellion made me oppose my mom at every turn. It was this very year I met Jude. Later, my mother clutched my hand and pleaded, "Sophia, don't go. Life with him will bring you no happiness." But I resolutely refused. "Mom, don't you see? Only with Jude do I feel loved. You've always favored Isabella over me." Tears streamed down my mother's face. "Do think of me, what will I do if you leave?" I smirked bitterly. "Isn't Isabella still here?" "My dear adopted sister. Isabella was the child of my father's colleague, who saved his life that year. After the colleague's death, he brought the man's daughter into our home. When Isabella first came to our house, she immediately went to my room and said enviously, 'Your room is so spacious.' To accommodate her feelings, my father let me give my room to Isabella. First it was my room, then a lipstick, a dress. I was his real daughter, yet in the end, I ended up yielding everything to Isabella. Classmates would ask, 'Sophia, is Isabella your real sister?' I smiled awkwardly. No. Once, when both Isabella and I had parent-teacher meetings, my father left me behind, saying, 'I'm going to Isabella's meeting.' My mother looked at me awkwardly. 'Sophia, try to understand your father.' I stared stiffly at my mother. It wasn't that I couldn't understand, but why must I endure this unfair treatment? And Isabella, with each concession I made, grew increasingly possessive of my belongings. Later, I left home and resolutely went away with Jude. I finally understood what my mother meant by, 'If you stay with him, you won't be happy.' It turns out that my mother had caught Isabella and Jude kissing back then. But she never told me. The day before I went to prison, she knelt on the ground crying, 'Sophia, don't grieve. Mom will avenge you.' I fixed my mother with a cold stare and smiled mockingly. Later, I heard news of my mother's death. She had asthma. The day she visited Isabella, the apartment was filled with flowers. I never learned what transpired between my mother and Isabella. She just died. I didn't go to school for the next few days. Until my father brought back Isabella home. Isabella looked almost identical to her previous life, wearing a white dress that made her appear endearingly pitiful. Everyone was fooled by her appearance, yielding to her repeatedly and letting her snatch my things. Isabella stood in the doorway, looked at me, and timidly greeted me, "Hello, sis." I lowered my eyes and, after a long pause, revealed an ambiguous smile. In my previous life, when I saw her, I immediately asked my father, "Dad, are you abandoning me?" But now I understand. I smiled and said, "Hello there, sister." The sunlight was dazzling, masking the hatred in my eyes. In the following days, I deliberately gave everything around me to Isabella. Isabella seemed very surprised, but I still caught the glee hidden beneath her expression. My father thought Isabella and I were getting along well. Patting my head, he said, "Well, you're doing the right thing." On the surface, I was smiling brightly. "Dad, do you really think your secret is hidden well?" Isabella's mother, your first love. In my previous life I had found out this secret. No wonder you always asked me to give everything to Isabella. All that partiality wasn't out of gratitude at all. It's because you're such a scumbag. On the way home, Isabella kept a firm hold on my wrist. "Sister, I heard there's a new transfer student at our school." Of course, I knew. And I also knew we'd run into him on the way later. But I merely pretended to be a love-struck maiden. "I know. The girls in the next class all say this new transfer student is really handsome." The interest on Isabella's face was barely concealable, especially after hearing my exclamation. In my previous life, when Isabella and I walked together, we happened to bump into Jude buying something at the grocery store. The young man was wearing a blue and white school uniform. His face stood out conspicuously in the crowd, with a small mole at the corner of his eye that gave him an even more aloof air. "That's our school's transfer student," I said at the time. "He's really handsome." Hearing this, Isabella asked, "Sister, you like this type, don't you?" I nodded without hesitation. Of course. In this life, I encountered Jude again sheltering from the sun under the small store's awning. The young man's fair skin glowed as his eyes squinted slightly against the bright sunlight. And he looked thoroughly impatient. Fine beads of sweat dotted the tip of his nose. Isabella nudged my shoulder and pointed at Jude, saying, "Sis, this is our school's transfer student, right, sis?" I nodded and took the initiative to say, "He's exactly my type." Isabella's voice bubbled with excitement, "Sis, this is totally your kind of guy." Isabella strode up to Jude and called out, "Hey." Her eyes curved into a perfect arc of smile. "Do you have WhatsApp?" She looked indistinguishable from other girls taking the initiative to ask for contacts. After Isabella got Jude's WhatsApp, she bounded over to me and said in an excited tone, "Sister, I got his contact information for you." I lowered my eyelids. If I remember correctly, at this time, most high school students are chatting on Facebook. I didn't suspect anything back then. By the time Isabella and Jude were almost getting along well, I still haven't even accepted Jude's WhatsApp friend request. Oh, my dear sister. She was really up to no good with ulterior motives. When we got home, my father was sitting on the sofa reading a newspaper. "Isabella," my father stood up when he saw her return and said pointedly on purpose, "I brought you a gift back from Italy this time." Isabella was overjoyed. "Really?" He only mentioned bringing a gift to Isabella, not me, so naturally, there was nothing for me. Indeed, that's how it was. In my past life, Isabella looked at me triumphantly in that little Italian dress. I cried and threw a tantrum at my father, "Why don't I have one? Am I not your daughter?" My mother looked at me helplessly before finally saying, "Sophia, I'll go shopping with you later." The scene played out again. Isabella took that beautiful little dress and exclaimed, "Wow, it's so beautiful." I just stood to the side, no crying, no making a fuss. My mother was sitting on the sofa, waiting for Isabella to finish trying on the dress. She looked up cautiously and said carefully, "Didn't you get a gift for Sophia?" An awkward atmosphere gradually spread through the air. After a long pause, my father finally said dryly, "I forgot." I didn't say anything else, just said, then I'll go upstairs to do my homework. My mother stopped me for the first time. Sophia, wait, I'll take you clothes shopping later. I stood on the stairs, forcing a somber expression. No need, Mom. I knew how painful it would be for my mother seeing this expression on my face. I even deliberately let 2 silent tears fall. Sophia's father, don't you dare go too far. My mother stood up, this is our own daughter. You forgot to buy her a gift but got one for someone else's daughter. How could you? This was the first time my father and mother confronted each other in so many years. My father rubbed his temples, looking extremely impatient. We're not short on money, are we? Just buy her another identical one later, won't that do? After all, the money you have is from me. You've no right to yell at me. The phrase "you've no right" laid bare the reality between my father and mother. He looked down on her. My mother's shoulders trembled as I watched her tears fall heavily onto the ground. Meanwhile, Isabella said innocently, I'm sorry, Uncle. Don't worry, it's not your fault, my father comforted her. I chewed the remaining candy in my mouth, producing faint crunching sounds. The post-rain sky was azure. I stared out the window and then opened another piece of candy. Soon there was a knock on my door. Mom stood outside, smiling when she saw me. Come on, let's go try on dresses. I nodded and walked over to her. My mother bought me more than a dozen beautiful dresses in one go. Every time I stepped out of the fitting room, she would exclaim, so pretty. In my past life, I'd spent so long in prison that I'd long forgotten I was also a girl who liked to wear dresses. After buying clothes, Mom and I walked down the street. Mom, I turned to her, how did you and Dad meet? Mom suddenly burst into tears. Choking up, she said, I'm sorry, Sophia. You've been through so much. Before your dad met me, he had a first love, and Isabella is her child. It seemed that my mother had done some investigating. I firmly grasped my mom's hand, looked into her eyes, and said, Mom, divorce Dad. Back at school, Isabella took the initiative to apologize to me again. I pretended not to care. It's okay. You've been with our family for so long, I've already regarded you as my sister. It's only natural that Dad buys you a dress. Isabella's expression stiffened slightly, and for the first time, she couldn't suppress a faint look of disgust. I nearly laughed out loud. Dad, the Isabella you dote on is your own daughter, she actually hates you. By the way, sis, I heard Kieran from the next class is pursuing you. Is that true? Isabella stood on tiptoes, looking innocent. In my previous life, I clearly rejected Kieran, only for Isabella and him to team up against me. But this time, I lowered my head and wore a bashful look. I like him too. I'm going to say yes to him next week. Isabella grew agitated. Sister, I thought you didn't like delinquents? A voice cut in sharply. Who the fuck are you calling a delinquent? Kieran, with his dyed red hair and a roguish grin, sneered. So you like me, huh? What about your cold act last week? Soon he resumed his cocky smirk. Playing hard to get, right? No need to wait until next week, I can be with you right now. I deliberately flashed a sweet smile. Isabella's face froze. I still have some solid connections. I'll have every guy on the street outside school call you Big Bros girl. At this age, it is enviable to be pursued. Sure enough, Isabella digs her nails into her palms, jealousy twisting her expression. Let's see, dear sister, how your precious ally from last life treats you in this life. The news that I was with Kieran quickly spread throughout the entire campus. Every day, someone would take the initiative to call me Big Bros girl, not to mention Kieran would stop talking to others the moment he saw me and run straight over to bask in the attention. This is your sister-in-law. Isabella was also teased by Kieran several times, like, third wheel, don't follow me and your sister. Kieran kept every promise he made to me and met all my needs. At the same time, Isabella stopped paying as much attention to Jude. Jealous of how close Kieran and I had become, she was desperate to be with him. One moment she was flirting with Kieran, and the next, he'd tell me about it. "Stay away from your sister," Kieran said, the disgust on his face barely hiding. I pretended to be shocked. She might just be doing it on a whim. Kieran's face remained expressionless, but I already knew he was annoyed. In my previous life, he wore this exact same expression when he was impatient. And then he'd deliberately trip me up. Sure enough, a few days later, Isabella's evening gown for the upcoming performance was slashed to shreds and thrown in the trash. Isabella's shoulders were heaving as she sobbed, her eyes red and swollen. "Without my dress, how can I perform? I've been practicing the piano so hard for this performance." Isabella originally couldn't play the piano at all. After coming to my home, my dad thought she should pick up a hobby and let her choose. When she saw the piano at my home, she said, "Uncle, I want to learn piano too." Isabella had no natural talent for the piano, and even with effort, her playing remained mediocre. What's more, she didn't learn piano because she liked it, she only did it for my sake. Kieran stood smoking in the corner, with a look of disdain. He was always like this even in my past life when he tormented me, he acted exactly the same way. Then someone said, "Doesn't Sophia play piano too?" And I remember she's at grade 10. She wouldn't even need to practice, this piece is intermediate difficulty at most, not hard at all. Right, and Sophia looks stunning in her school uniform. Isabella's not in good form anyway, hasn't she always struggled with a certain part when she plays? Isabella stiffened. "No, I'm fine, I can do this," she said in a hurry. But the people around gave her no chance. "Your makeup's smeared from crying, don't you need time to redo it?" I didn't need this performance, but suddenly I wanted Isabella to experience what it felt like to have something taken away. So I pretended to be reluctant and took the stage with an awkward air. After the performance, Isabella's face darkened. I deliberately said, "Little sister, you look scary. You wouldn't hate me over this, would you?" Isabella forced a smile. "How could I, dear sister?" Kieran stood nearby and said to me, "Stay away from her." Isabella stared at Kieran in disbelief, as if she had just realized something, and said, "Kieran, was this your doing?" "What did I do?" Kieran shrugged casually. After leaving with Kieran, I turned on my phone. I found that my WhatsApp suddenly had many new friend requests, including Jude. I lowered my eyes to hide the flicker of keen interest within them. Perhaps I could use Kieran to deal with both Jude and Isabella. After adding Jude on WhatsApp, I soon struck up a conversation with him. In just a few days, we became quite familiar with each other. Thanks to my past life memories, I knew exactly what kind of girl he liked. Jude was wearing his school uniform, holding a can of soda. Then he handed me another bottle of plain water. Jude quickly coated the soda can. "Girls should drink less soda," he explained. I nodded and suddenly felt an intense gaze upon me. Kieran was standing in the corner, staring at me and Jude. I smiled brightly. "I gotta go. My boyfriend's waiting for me." I spoke loudly enough to ensure Kieran could hear. Sure enough, Kieran relaxed and started walking toward me. I had just taken a few steps forward when Jude grabbed my wrist. "You promised me. I'll be waiting for you at my place on Saturday." Jude's wrist had prominent joints. He wasn't giving me a cold look, instead, he was looking at me with the eyes of someone in love. Yet I only felt a sense of repulsion. In my past life, he had never shown me such a look before. The footprints trampling on me and the ugly scars on the back of my hand were all inflicted by this man. Kieran frowned and rushed over, yanked Jude's hand off my wrist. "What do you mean? Keep your hands off my girlfriend." Jude's face stiffened. "He's your boyfriend?" I nodded. Kieran grabbed Jude by the collar. "Stay away from my girlfriend from now on." The air between them stiffened with tension. I broke the tension. "Kieran, let's go." But that is not enough. I didn't keep my distance from Jude. On Saturday I went to his place. Jude was wearing a white suit. Coincidentally, I was also wearing a white dress. The party invited many of his old classmates, all of whom thought I was Jude's girlfriend. Jude, you said you wouldn't date in high school, didn't you, buddy? The people around started teasing. I recognized many of these faces from before. In the previous life, they treated me coldly while showing warmth to Isabella. When Jude and I got married, none of his friends were present. Later I learned Jude had let them not come. That woman in prison told me, before I was sentenced, Isabella and I were close friends. Isabella said that, from beginning to end, Jude only married you because of business relationships. I forced a fake smile. Everyone, stop teasing, Jude and I are just classmates. My boyfriend isn't him. The surroundings suddenly fell silent. Jude's face darkened too. He probably never expected I'd say such things in front of so many people, especially since I'm currently his female companion. Soon, someone started smoothing things over. Does having a boyfriend mean you can't break up? Right? The people around all laughed together. I knew this group had low moral standards from my previous life, so these words didn't even make me blink. After the banquet, Jude said, "Sophia, I'm going to pursue you." Coincidentally, I happened to be on the phone with Kieran. Through the Bluetooth headset, Kieran remained silent for just a few seconds, declaring, "Jude is done for." Indeed. What I had endured in my past life would now be revisited by Jude. In school, Isabella didn't approach me for several consecutive days. Kieran stressed her out so much that her mental state collapsed. "Did your sister put you up to this?" Isabella cried out hysterically to Kieran. She was referring to their earlier conversation in the recording. In the recording, Isabella said, "Kieran, be with me. I'm the boyfriend of your sister, she can never win against me in anything. You'll come to like me too, right?" This audio clip was posted on the online forum and quickly went viral. Isabella is shameless, WTF, the sister crushing on her sister's boyfriend? This is insane. Since she didn't come looking for me, I didn't seek her out either. Because I had been keeping an eye on Jude. Kieran leveraged all his connections to target Jude. Jude soon suffered from both overt and covert mockery. Not only that, nearly all the boys ostracized Jude. A few days later, Kieran and Jude fought on the playground. I just stood by and watched them injure each other. The two fought fiercely, even when people around tried to pull them apart, they shoved them away. When they were finally called away by the school authorities, I let out a sigh. If only they could go even further. In the end, Kieran didn't dare to do anything, after all. After Kieran and Jude came out of the office at the same time, I stood in front of Kieran and said, "Kieran, let's break up." The young boy's eyes reddened instantly. What? Why? What did I do wrong? I lowered my gaze. Because you hurt Jude. Looking at Kieran's face twisted with jealousy, I felt a flicker of pleasure in me. Yes, like that. And I just needed to add fuel to the fire. I whispered, "I think I've fallen for Jude." Both of them were stunned simultaneously. Immediately after, Kieran swung a punch. "How dare you steal my girl?" Jude's face was already covered in injuries, and with this fresh punch, he coughed up a mouthful of blood. I shouted, "Stop fighting." A few days later, Jude's family came to the school, and Kieran was suspended for fighting. Jude stood in front of me. "Did you really mean it when you said you had feelings for me?" Meanwhile, Isabella stood aside in the corner, her eyes burning with jealousy. I had just opened my mouth when Isabella cut in. Isabella smiled with her eyes curved and said, "Sis, didn't you say you liked Kieran the most? My silly little sister is still trying to compete with me. Alright, I'll let you have this one. I'm curious what kind of expression you'd have when everything that happened to me in my past life befalls you one by one." This thought thrilled me extremely. I pretended to be coerced. "Yes, that's what I said back then." As I turned my head, 2 more tears rolled down. "If others find out, they'll say you're stealing someone's partner." This was just complete nonsense from me. But Jude showed a bit of pity in his eyes before looking at Isabella, who was standing aside. Isabella forced down her smirk. I knew Isabella was being smug again. But my dear sister, Jude hates nothing more than someone makes him unable to get what he wants. Jude pinned Isabella against the corner. I hid around the corner and heard Jude's low voice simmering with anger. "You're not innocent." Isabella's eyes were softly rounded at the corners, making her look like a delicate little white flower. Now, this little white flower, risking being choked to death, slowly leaned closer to Jude's face. She kissed Jude on the lips. Sure enough, Jude trembled violently, but his grip only tightened. On the verge of death, Isabella's neck was freed. She sat on the ground and broke into violent coughing. Jude lowered his eyes and left with no expression. In the darkness, I thought, as expected of lovers from a past life, drawn together by fate even in this one. Isabella was feeling exceptionally cheerful. Humming a tune, she gave me a sweet smile. "Sis, you can head home after school today. No need to wait for me." I nodded, only to hear Isabella ask me, "Sis, did you kiss Jude?" "Jude said he likes me." I turned my head to look at Isabella. Isabella's eyes and brows curved into crescents. "Sister, are you feeling a little sad?" Yes, I said this deliberately for Isabella to hear. Only as she gets closer to Jude will I have a better chance to execute my revenge plan. Kill two birds with one stone. My hand slowly traced a curve. I still maintain the same distance from Jude as before. Jude has been visibly unsettled whenever we've been together recently. Especially when he sees Isabella behind us, the hand that was on my shoulder would immediately drop, and he'd quickly put some distance between us. My sister succeeded in winning Jude over. But she forgot there was still someone. Her former ally, Kieran, who desperately wanted to be with me. Who would have thought he was still secretly keeping an eye on me even after dropping out of school? I glanced at a corner of the bushes and then smiled faintly. I proactively reached out to Jude. "You seem a bit distracted recently. What happened? Why don't you tell me?" Jude's eyes were filled with confusion. "Your sister said she fell for a boy." I lowered my eyes and continued, "I'm actually quite curious. After all, my sister is so naive, I worry someone might take advantage of her. Could you help me find out who that boy is?" In the sunlight, Jude's facial features were nothing less than perfect. Compared to his former self, he now seemed more human. And even less capable of hiding his thoughts. Jude ran a hand through his hair in frustration, frowning. "I don't know." I lifted my lips and grasped Jude's wrist. Jude visibly stiffened before shaking off my hand. "Sorry, let me think about it." The latter part of the journey home, I walked alone. I held my phone, the footsteps behind me so faint I could barely hear them. I pretended to be listening to music, but no sound was coming through the earphones. A hand suddenly blocked my path. Kieran was wearing a black cap, glaring at me viciously. "He cheated on you. On Friday night, I saw him kissing your sister." The earphone cable draped over my shoulder, tracing a perfect arc. I whispered, "But I still like him. What should I do?" I know Kieran all too well. Long before he sent me to prison in my previous life, I had seen through his true color. He wanted me, yet went mad at not having me, ultimately developing the desire to destroy me. But this life is different. He briefly became my boyfriend, only for Jude to suddenly steal me away. So, now, Kieran's face is filled with rage. I added more fuel to the fire. "Actually, I liked you too, but somehow, after Jude appeared, my feelings for you strangely diminished." The young man wore a black sweatshirt, nearly blending into the dusk. His voice trembled. "Really?" I stared into his eyes, feeling no sympathy for this culprit of my ruin. "Yes," I rubbed my stiff back muscles as I watched Kieran disappear down the twilight road. Let everything go according to my plan. After the exam ended, Isabella and I went home. I stood at the doorway with my backpack. Inside the house, my mother sat on the sofa while my father kept his distance from her. Strangely enough, the scene looked harmonious. Isabella was the first to put on a big smile. "Uncle, Auntie, we're back." My father nodded amiably. "Uncle got you a concert ticket. You're a big fan of that star lately, aren't you?" Isabella beamed. "Thank you, Uncle," and then there was no more to it. My dad didn't say anything to me, just like in my past life. But I'd long grown accustomed to it, so I said nothing this time. I just tightened my grip on the backpack strap. My mother spoke up. Sophia, your father and I are divorced. We'll be moving out today. Oh, my mom looked at me. Mom got you a little cake today. Isabella froze for a moment, then looked at me and my mom. Auntie, is it because of me? My mom shook her head. It's not your fault. After packing all my belongings, my mother and I left this home by car. Sophia, will you miss this home? I put on a smile. No. In my past life, when Jude took me away, he had asked me the same question. I said, no. All my feelings for this home vanished after Isabella came. My father's blatant favoritism, my mother's weakness, everything weighed on me miserably. But fortunately, in this life, my mother has found her courage. The exam results came out soon. In my past life, my grades were bad, especially after getting together with Jude. And now, I lowered my eyes and stared at my exam results. In my previous life, although I played the piano well, my poor academic performance still prevented me from being admitted to my dream college. The glaring red 57 foot on the test paper stabbed at my eyes harshly. Isabella sat on the chair with a beaming smile. Sis, you're at the bottom again, huh? Soon someone exclaimed, Isabella, no doubt you're first in the grade again. That's not certain. Isabella shyly lowered her head, a blush spreading across her face. I asked Jude, he said he got full marks in math and did quite well in science subjects. I simply organized the wrong answers on the test paper and marked the questions I didn't understand. From now on, my top priority must be focused on studying. My mother specially rented an apartment near the school for me, so I no longer lived in the dormitory. Late at night, I reworked all the problems the teacher had gone over today, then drew a mind map. My mom came in with a glass of milk and put it next to my desk. Get some rest early. I nodded. This little rented place, though not as glamorous as our old house, felt very warm. Outside the window, the traffic was heavy with cars coming and going in a continuous flow. In the time that followed, I ignored Jude whenever he tried to reach me. Isabella grew closer to Jude, I often saw them together. But none of that mattered to me. In the second monthly exam, I successfully improved my total score from 370 to 430 points. I ended up being the fifth from the bottom in the class. Isabella posted on WeChat moments, took first place in the class again this time. I wasn't discouraged, instead, I worked even harder than before. Soon when the winter vacation arrived, my grades had climbed to the middle of the class ranking. As for Isabella, because she was dating Jude, both their grades declined. The brief winter vacation came at last. Will Kieran, who has been lying low in the dark, surprise me during this winter vacation? During the short winter vacation, I took the initiative to visit Kieran. After asking his brothers about his recent situation, I stood in front of an auto repair shop, watching Kieran work on a car. He was wearing a gasoline-stained black sweatshirt. When he saw me, he turned his face slightly. Kieran. My nose was red from the cold weather, and I applied blush at the corners of my eyes, making me look like I had just been crying. Kieran froze in place, looking quite impatient. What do you want? I looked at his fingers curling up nervously before hugging him. I said softly, are you abandoning me too? A cold wind blew past us. Kieran stiffened, but soon after, he hugged me back. Jude hasn't treated you well, has he? I nodded and then said with a sobbing voice, Kieran, you love me, don't you? The young boy nodded firmly and said, I asked cautiously, how much love? Love you enough to die for you. I'll make those who hurt you pay their due. There is no need to add fuel to the fire anymore, because the person before me is already prepared to do everything I want him to do. Throughout the winter break, I was in high spirits because of this. When school started again, there was a new boy next to Isabella. The boy was the gang leader of the vocational high school, with a malicious smile often playing at the corners of his mouth. Isabella now felt what it was like to be called big sister-in-law by the surrounding students. Jude's face darkened whenever he saw Isabella now. She had actually cheated on him with some thug. "Sis," Isabella stood before me, smiling brightly. Recently, her vanity has been greatly satisfied, not to mention she was enjoying the treatment I once received. "Do you get cockroaches in that rented apartment where you live with Auntie?" "Actually, I often feel like Uncle is my own father. Just last week, he bought me another bag worth 30,000 yuan. I smiled without replying. Isabella felt a bit frustrated. But soon, she grew tired of being with this delinquent. Their values were different. Isabella had been pampered her whole life, while this man was dirt poor yet pretentiously acted wealthy, wearing fake designer clothes and occasionally even asking her for money. But soon, Isabella realized breaking up with the man before her wouldn't be that easy. The man clung to her like stubborn chewing gum, driving her utterly mad with annoyance. Kieran wiped off his sweat. "I just gave that guy Isabella's contact information. To prevent me from thinking he was evil," he explained. "It's all your sister's own fault, right?" I nodded. Kieran had already caused Isabella a big trouble. Jude started approaching me recently. I rejected his advances while secretly observing Kieran's progress. Jude was clever. He repeatedly countered Kieran's schemes and even secretly warned him. The two were locked in a silent tug-of-war. Inside the convenience store, I put away the Odin and then tilted my head to look at Jude. "But I still can't accept you, because I like Kieran." Jude smirked and said, "Oh? Then you said you liked me before. Clearly you don't like Kieran that much either." Rain began falling outside the window. Jude's eyes, as clear as glass, sparkled with lively amusement. He grabbed my wrist and pulled me slightly closer to his body. We were close. A voice interrupted, "Don't touch her." In the alley veiled by rain and lit only by a dim street light, Kieran grabbed Jude by the collar and slammed his head violently against the wall with a sickening crack. "Stop fighting." At this moment, I bore an uncanny resemblance to the female lead in those cheesy idol dramas. But my thoughts differed from the heroines. Both fought with murderous intensity, blood seeping into the rainwater. With cold detachment, I called the police when the fight had gone on for a while. Days later, Jude died in the fight and could not be saved, while Kieran was sentenced to life imprisonment for the crime of intentional homicide. Kieran's voice was somewhat unclear, muffled. "Sophia, live well in the future without waiting for me." I gazed at Kieran through the glass window. Some truths are better left unspoken than said, too absurd to voice. 1 year later, I was admitted to my dream university with outstanding grades, whereas Isabella, after constant clashes with that delinquent, saw her academic performance plummet, eventually ending up at a non-prestigious university. My mom and I strolled down the street together. My father was diagnosed with cancer and had been busy consulting doctors recently, hoping to cure the early-stage cancer. Since treating cancer required a large amount of money, Isabella sold many belongings to raise medical expenses for her father. Meanwhile, Mom opened a dessert shop this year. Everything is moving in a positive direction.